the industry itself acknowledges that oil discoveries peaked quite some time ago, about 40 years ago, in fact. Now, there's this little optimistic uptick on the end of the graph. What's going on there? Do we have some rosier times to look forward to? Well, if we zoom in, what we see is that 1999 and 2000 were extraordinarily good years in recent times for oil discovery. Those were the years of finds in Kazakhstan, the Kashagan field. But 2001, 2002 have resumed the general downward trend in discovery. And as for 2003, Chris Grabowski, editor of Petroleum Review, describes the year's exploration results as little short of horrifying. In fact, the oil industry as a whole spent in 2003 $8 billion on exploration, and they found $4 billion worth of oil. Not very encouraging. If you go back to the 1960s, you see this is discovery minus consumption. As of the 1960s and before, going back to the beginning of the oil age, we were finding more oil every year by far than we were extracting and burning. That trend gradually changes, and the inflection point is right around 1980. Since 1980, we've been extracting and burning more oil every year than we currently we are extracting about 5 times as much oil every year as we discover. So what's the response of the industry to this? This chart is basically the same as the last one we just saw, except superimposed on it is this line here, which represents the number of wildcat wells being drilled. Wildcats are exploratory wells. Nothing has been found in this region. We're going to go out there and look and see what we can discover. Okay, we see with the falling discovery trend, industry's response was to increase the number of wildcat wells, up to a point where it became clear that it was merely good money chasing bad. And the number of wildcat wells has been dropping precipitously since then. And the reason for that is simply because the oil companies are not finding that much. So economists who say, well, as the price of oil increases, that'll just stimulate more discovery, are not taking into account the fact that there just may not be that much left to find. Certainly, more oil will be found, no question about it. But what we are finding are, on average, much smaller wells and very often of lower quality resource. Now, the next 3 slides are interesting because they are from a PowerPoint presentation given internally at the Paris headquarters of the International Energy Agency, the IEA, which is sort of the global equivalent of the U.S. Department of Energy. And so the IEA, which tends to be extremely optimistic in its forecasts of oil production going forward, even the IEA is warning of a coming oil shock. Why? Because older fields are mature and declining. New discoveries are of smaller fields. The industry is being forced to produce flat out. Global reserves have been overstated for political reasons. This is amazing to see coming officially from the IEA. A number of petroleum geologists have been warning about this for many years, saying that in fact, particularly OPEC reserves have been dramatically overstated. Back in the late 1980s, a rule change was made among the OPEC exporting nations saying that member nations could export in proportion to their stated reserves. So this was an incentive for the OPEC nations to state higher reserves so that they could export more, gain market share, gain more import revenue. And exactly that happened. Within a couple of years, every OPEC nation stated reserve increases of between 50 and 200%, even though virtually no new important discoveries had occurred in any of these countries. So is all of that oil actually there or not? Probably most of it is not. And even the IEA is saying so. There's a shift to more expensive, risky, non-conventional areas for exploration, and so the industry has to run harder just to tread water, just to offset depletion. This is another way of looking at that problem. Every year, the industry has to find and develop new resources just to stay even with increased demand, right? Demand is increasing at, let's say, this chart is about millions of barrels of production per day. Right now, the world is using about 82 million barrels of oil per day. 82 million a day. That's a good fact to keep in mind. So each year, say in 2005, the global oil industry is going to have to develop about 1.5 million to 2 million barrels a day of new production to stay even with increased demand. We're seeing demand exploding in places like China, which is increasing its oil imports at a rate of 30 to 40% per year now. Just this year, China surpassed Japan to become the world's second foremost oil importing nation. We have this nice picture in our mind of the Chinese riding millions of bicycles through their city streets, but in fact, the Chinese banned bicycles on city streets in Shanghai last year because they were getting in the way of the cars. The Chinese, of course, are buying cars by the millions. Demand is also exploding here in the U.S. and in India. So global demand for oil is increasing, so we have to develop new resources to meet demand. But on top of that, the industry has to develop another 4 million barrels a day or so of new production to offset declines of production from older wells that are past their production peaks. So what this chart is telling us is that next year, the global oil industry will have to develop about 5.75 million barrels a day of new production just to stay even. Okay? That's a pretty good feat. If we can do that, we'll be doing really well. Problem is, next year, we have to do the same thing. And the year after that, we have to do the same thing, only even more. And so on out. And this is cumulative. Right? And this is given the fact that, again, this is an IEA slide. This is from the International Energy Agency internal presentation. Historic OPEC spare production capacity, we see, has always ranged somewhere between 4 and 10 million barrels a day. That's what countries can produce over and above what they actually are producing at any given moment. Well, it's in the late 80s it starts to go downhill and recovers a bit, and as of 2004, it has practically disappeared. There's virtually no spare production capacity in the global system at this point. So if this is true, why are we hearing such optimistic forecasts from the U.S. government, the U.S. Department of Energy, the U.S. Geological Survey, saying basically, don't worry, folks, there's plenty of oil in the ground, plenty of natural gas, we don't have to worry. Maybe in 2020, 2030, we might have to start thinking about developing some alternative energy sources. Well, the USGS produced a report in 1999 that was extraordinarily optimistic, and the basis of that report was, among other things, looking at likely future discovery. The USGS used a statistical system which said, let's look in parts of the world, let's think about parts of the world where we haven't really explored that much yet, like, for example, East Greenland. We can be 95% sure that 1 barrel of oil will be found in East Greenland. 95% sure. We can only be 5% sure that a considerable